Aaron Rodgers said something, and now Jets fans are speculating about a big trade, but it's a little early for that. I'm sorry to tell you. That and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, July 12th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, July 12th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's show, we're going to do a mailbag. Next week, we get back into our regular schedule. We'll have episodes Monday through Friday. Normally, we do our mailbag shows on Wednesday, but we're in the summer right now. It's been a long time since we did the mailbag, so thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. And our first question deals with a potential blockbuster that's now being speculated about. John, Aaron Rodgers mentioned this week that he looks forward to playing with Davante Adams again. Do you think the Jets and Raiders could work out a trade sometime soon? And the short answer to that is sometime soon depends on what you how you define soon. I don't think anything's going to be imminent. I just can't imagine the Raiders are in a mindset where they're going to be looking to trade Davante Adams before the start of the season. Of course, like anything can happen, but just taking an educated guess, it'd be very surprising. I mean, I know 4 years ago the Jets did trade Jamal Adams this time of year, but trades this time of year are kind of unusual, especially involving high-profile players because teams are getting ready for the season. And with a handful of exceptions, most teams in this league think that they got a shot to win. Some teams are more confident than others, but unless you're at the very bottom of the league, everybody's playing to try and win games this year. So it's very unusual you trade a good player at this point of the year because, at the beginning of the offseason and like the March, April timeframe, if you trade a player, you get a draft pick in return, maybe a high draft pick. You can really say, okay, we traded our player, but we got something we can use to improve our team this year. We can draft it. We can draft somebody with the pick we got, and maybe that guy will step in and play really well. At this point, you're talking about very delayed gratification. You're not getting unless you're doing like a player for player trade. And I don't think the Jets would trade a player for Davante Adams, or at least I don't think a player would be the centerpiece to a trade for Davante Adams. The Raiders would probably get like a pick in 2025, which has value. I'm not saying 25 picks lack value. In fact, future picks, if anything, are undervalued in this league because teams are so short-term focused. But I don't think that the Raiders would do it. I think the Raiders want to win. I think the Raiders view themselves, maybe they don't view themselves as a contender, but they view themselves as a team that can at least be a solid team in the AFC. And if things go right, maybe they can make the playoffs. Just hired a new coach, Antonio Pierce, and I would imagine that if I was the Raiders, I would think Pierce kind of straightened things out at the end of last year. After the Josh McDaniels experiment went awry. So let's see what we can do with our team. We're not going to trade our best receiver right before the start of the season. And I'll say this: Aaron Rodgers made the comment he looks forward to playing with Davante Adams again, and I got to say, for content creators like myself, that's a great thing to hear in July because we're in July. There's not much going on. Training camp hasn't started yet. So there's really no storylines around the team. So it's great when Aaron Rodgers generates headlines like that because, it gives us something to talk about. It gets fans a reason to be really excited. And I'm sorry I have to be the voice of reason on this, but I just don't think that it's very likely at this point in time. Now, once we get into the season, of course, things could change. Is it conceivable? Yeah, maybe the Raiders fall out of the race. Maybe they're not as good as they're expecting to be. Adams is a kind of an aging receiver. The Jets, of course, if they get off to a good start, may look for that one final piece of the puzzle that can help them make a run. Of course, Rodgers and Adams have great chemistry. Would I rule it out once we get, closer to the trade deadline if the Raiders have fallen out of the race? No, I would not. I mean, anything's possible. But as for right now, I just don't think it's going to happen. And we know that the Jets at least leaked. I mean, I don't know how serious this was. The Jets did leak before last year's trade deadline that they were interested in Davante Adams and decided that after they couldn't get Davante Adams, well, we're not going to do anything. So how much of that was the Jets just trying to make it sound like they were active to the fan base so that fans wouldn't get upset that they were quiet? I don't really know, but I think that it's conceivable. I'm not saying it's necessarily likely. It depends on what happens. First of all, the Jets have to get off to a good start so that they're buyers at the deadline. The Jets also, Raiders may need to fall again. Raiders may need to fall out of the race and just decide we're selling. We're going to try and focus on the future now. Now, if that happens, it's conceivable. But short of that, I don't think so, and it's certainly not right now. We're just not at the point of the year where teams are going to trade away their high-profile players, unless it's like a Jamal Adams scenario where the player's really unhappy. And I don't get the feeling Adams is really unhappy because he was a guy who pushed for Antonio Pierce to be the head coach. If they hired somebody other than Pierce, there was talk that a lot of their guys were kind of want out of Las Vegas. So in that scenario, maybe it'd be a little bit more likely. But right now, I think look, Rodgers says he wants to play with Davante Adams. I don't think that's exactly a secret, but just because Rodgers wants to play with Davante Adams, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. I think that it's something down the line. So I'm sorry again to burst everybody's bubble. I know we're in the middle of July. I know everybody's dreaming, and hey, the Jets have a pretty good roster this year, so there's reason to be excited. And I think if the Jets get off to the start they want, they certainly will be buyers at the trade deadline, and they'll look to add pieces. Whether it's at wide receiver or whether it's somewhere else, I don't know, but I think it's a little, we're a little early in the game to talk about potentially trading for Davante Adams. Our next question is Brady Latham better than other Jets backup offensive linemen, especially guards? So you may not be familiar with Brady Latham. He was a guy the Jets signed as an undrafted free agent out of Arkansas. Look, it would be nice, but I think if we're talking about undrafted rookies, we're probably not talking about guys who are going to be able to step in and play effectively this season. I think the spread for any undrafted rookie is try and develop, spend your year on the practice field. Now, look, I do think it's important when we talk about building offensive line depth. The way you do that is through the late round picks, through the undrafted guys, because even guys who are good backups on other teams, once they hit free agency, they're going to find starting jobs because there's a dearth of quality offensive linemen in this league. So you have to develop your own offensive line depth. It would be nice if Latham could do it. And look, I actually looked through this the last 5 years or so, and typically there's like 1 to 2 undrafted free agents who make the roster for the Jets. And with the expanded practice squads, there's more of an opportunity for an undrafted guy to at least find this chance to develop. The league has expanded the practice squad in decent years, which really gives an opportunity for a player like Latham to really work on the practice field, develop his technique, learn how to play against NFL talent. I don't think it's going to be this year. I think if this is a guy, you could always be surprised. Sometimes guys are better than you expect them to be. But I do think if the Jets are depending on somebody like Brady Latham this year, it's probably not a great situation. I would not feel comfortable right now unless something happens that we're not expecting. I would not feel comfortable him being a guy that you depend on. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about the upcoming season. The Jets have high expectations. Which player could benefit from the influx of talent on the offense? Which position groups are we worried about? I'll give you some thoughts on that continuing here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We've been in summer mode the last couple of weeks, but we'll be back to our normal 5-day-a-week schedule on Monday, where we'll have new episodes each weekday. and then some bonus episodes as needed if there's breaking news or anything we need to address. So we'll have back to 5 days a week on Monday. Thanks so much for tuning into the show. We continue now with our mailbag. Our next question, John, it feels like the offense has really improved. Which individual player do you think will benefit most from a better supporting cast? So I know what you're all going to say. I know what everybody's going to say, but I'm going to give you a different answer. I know everybody's going to say Garrett Wilson. And the reason everyone's going to say Garrett Wilson is because, he was the only threat the Jets had at the wide receiver position a year ago. Now we've got Mike Williams as our number 2 receiver. And I mean, just think about that. I mean, a year ago, people were trying to talk ourselves into Lazard as a number 2 receiver, as a legit number 2 receiver. I mean, think about that. Then we got Mike Williams, a really good receiver, as our number 2 guy. That's a number 2 receiver. None of this Lazard stuff from a year ago. Garrett's going to draw less attention. Garrett's also going to benefit from better quarterback play. Statistically, I'm not certain Garrett's counting stats are necessarily going to increase exponentially, though. Now, there's the argument that under the surface, Garrett Wilson's really a top 5 receiver in this league, and once now he's got a good quarterback, now he's got a good supporting cast, he's ready to go, from 1,000 to 1,100 yards, all the way to like 1,500, 1,600 yards. It's possible, but I think last year Garrett's counting stats were still pretty good, and the reason for that was, I think there were a couple of things behind it. Number one is nobody else could get open. Number 2 is you had an inexperienced quarterback who didn't really know how to read defenses. So in that situation, the number 1 guy is going to see a lot of targets. Garrett's a legitimately really good receiver. So Zach Wilson didn't trust anybody else. So if all things were equal and nobody was open, he's going to throw the ball to Garrett. And that's why Garrett was like among the league leaders in targets last year. And he was I don't want to say he was an inefficient target, because I don't think it was his fault that, his numbers. But if you look at the passes where Garrett Wilson was targeted, the Jets were inefficient. And that's because, they were throwing it to him in a lot of situations where he didn't really have a chance, whether the pass was inaccurate or, he was just blanketed in coverage and the ball came his way because nobody else could get open. And he was the only one who had Zach Wilson's trust. I think that the efficiency will go up with Garrett Wilson. You'll see less inefficient plays going Garrett Wilson's way because you have better quarterback, and he won't be able to draw as much attention. I know people are going to say Garrett Wilson's going to be the biggest beneficiary of the improved talent on offense. I think it's going to be Breece Hall. And, you have to think, like, Breece Hall, his numbers last year were good, but they weren't spectacular. And look, this is my opinion. I think Breece Hall is a spectacular talent at the running back position. I think there were moments where, he didn't hit holes decisively enough. I think with a bad offensive line, you can't dance around as much as Breece does. Although, you know what people say that, they kind of refer to it as the Le'Veon Bell problem when he was with the Jets. How, Bell's patient, but with a bad offensive line that can't hold blocks, you can't be as patient. My counter to that would be, what sort of running style does work when you have a bad offensive line? Nothing's really going to work if you have a bad offensive line. This year, on paper, hopefully the offensive line is better. And I think that there's reason to believe the offensive line will be better. Just did a show yesterday where I talked about some Jets bounce back seasons of recent memory where they were able to get quite a bit of improvement by making a couple changes on their offensive line. So it's certainly, conceivable. And I think, it's even plausible that the offensive line will improve. Well, better offensive line means, Breece broke big runs last year. What Breece didn't do last year as much was like the normal mundane 5 to 6 yard gains. And for me, a running back, what he does, what the running back brings to the table are the monster runs. The more mundane runs are whether they're blocked well or not for you. The question is, like, if you block a 5 yard gain for most running backs, they're gonna be able to get you 5 yards. Breece can take the first 5 yards and then add an extra 45 to them. Breece can rip off 50-yard gains. So I think he'll be better. I think it's also going to be easier with that. And I know this is a cliche. It's an easy thing to say with the Jets passing attack in the state it was a year ago. I think that it's going to be easier because there's going to be a passing threat this year. And there's also going to be situations where Aaron Rodgers is going to see that there's, an advantage in the box for the Jets, and he'll just check to a run in a way maybe Zach Wilson would not. So Breece is going to get the ball in much more fortuitous situations this year. So I think Breece Hall has a chance to, make it. And you're starting to see this in the fan. And it always makes me nervous when all the fantasy analysts say this. Breece Hall's going to have a breakout year, but man, I really think Breece Hall's going to have a great year this year for the Jets. I think he's finally going to establish himself. I think he's going to establish himself as one of the premier backs in this league. Next question: what projected starters do you have the least confidence in? So I don't really have that many concerns. I think I have more blanket concerns about health, about age. I think, on paper, this Jets team looks pretty good. I think, with the weakness safety, if safety is your weakness, I don't think that's a big deal. Tight end's okay, but tight end doesn't break your team. If you have a great one like a Travis Kelce or a George Kittle or a Mark Andrews, it can make your team. It doesn't break your team. And it's not like the Jets have awful tight ends. I mean, Conklin puts up the number. Conklin plays the way he did last year, they'll be fine in tight end. But that's not a very important position. So I think the Jets are fine. I think my concerns are less, position group than just overall the age of the roster, especially important players, health, lots of injury risk, and those things go hand in hand. So I guess if we're talking about a unit where I'm a little nervous, and like I just said, I think the offensive line on paper is going to improve quite a bit. I think it's going to make Breece Hall a much better player. So I'm not saying that I'm worried per se about performance. I'm worried about health because you got Tyron Smith there starting at left tackle, who's a guy who really, really struggles to stay on the field. Elijah Vera Tucker, even though if you've heard the show, you know that I'm optimistic about AVT's ability to stay on the field because I feel like his injuries were not necessarily chronic things that are likely to be repeated. I think they were more freak things that aren't. There's no increased risk of him resuffering an injury, but I think you have to acknowledge, and even Morgan Moses, who's been reliable, who's been durable and able to stay on the field, he just missed time last year for the first time in quite a while. As he ages, will he become more injury prone? Most guys are. So it's really about health. Now, I will say my mind is eased a bit by the drafting of Olu Fashanu. I was vocal heading into the draft that I felt like if all things were equal, the Jets needed to draft a tackle for just this reason. You're dealing with older tackles right now. Fashanu's a rookie. There's some risk. How will a rookie play? Rookie tackles, some of them go in and play effectively. It's very rare a rookie tackle steps in and dominates them. So you've got the guy who Fashanu, I think it's fair to expect him to be a quality backup, but that's a big drop off from Tyron Smith. And Tyron Smith's a guy who, I refer to as a multiplier on this line because he makes everybody better around him. So I guess to the extent I'm nervous, it's not necessarily that I think any of the position groups are weak. It's just injuries, and there's probably no place that's more profound. And this is probably just like the experience of having the last couple of years where the Jets suffer a million injuries on the offensive line. I'm sure that's playing into my mindset, but I worry a little bit. If you're asking me for a position where I'm a little worried about injuries more than others, it's the offensive line. Now, if you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, I have to take a Miami Dolphins fan to task. There's actually a Dolphins fan who left a comment when I asked for mailbag questions, and he has something to say about a Star Jets player, and I don't think he's right. And we'll go into that a little bit more as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We are doing a mailbag show. Our next question is actually from a Dolphins fan. I think this might be the first Dolphins fan who's ever sent in a question for our mailbag. As a fan base who has seen 2 years of Sauce Gardner in action, forget the Pro Bowls. Just base it solely on the production on the field. Do you think he was worth the 4th overall pick? I understand what he is and what he isn't. But for me, 2 interceptions in 2 years is a bit lackluster when the 4th overall pick could have went to something more conducive to the win column. Okay, I want to be nice to Dolphins fans who frequent the show, but I could not disagree more with any of those statements. Sauce Gardner did not just justify the 4th overall pick in his first 2 seasons. There's a very strong case to be made that Sauce Gardner should have been the number 1 overall pick. I mean, we want to say conducive to the win column. It's a passing league. I mean, look at the money receivers are getting across the league because of the difference they make. So you have a guy who could shut down the elite receivers in the league. That's super valuable. 2 interceptions. So I think this is the part of the problem when you evaluate football is a lot of people follow multiple sports. And typically across any sport, there may be 3 to 5 stats that you use to judge players. The NBA, points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. In baseball, batting average, on base percentage, slugging, home runs, RBI. That's a bad example because baseball is much more statistically inclined these days. But in the past, hockey, goals, assists, point. And again, these sports are becoming more advanced, so it's not as true anymore. But generally speaking, a lot of these stats give you a good sense of how good a player is. In football, the handful of stats we use really don't articulate how good a guy is a lot, and that's true in a lot of different positions. And at corner, the statistics the regular statistics aren't super important. Interceptions, well, here's the thing: a lot of the great corners in the league intimidate other teams. The other teams don't throw the ball at the great corners because they know they have no shot. So you can't use interceptions. I mean, look at some of Revis's seasons. Revis had a couple seasons where he had 0 interceptions and he still dominated because nobody threw his way. So I don't think it's fair to look at Sauce Gardner and say 2 interceptions, he's not that good, because that's that's a handful of plays a year. And yeah, there are some guys who are real ball hawks like Richard Sherman, who, having a lot of interceptions, even as they're a dominant quarter, enhances their resume. But the great corners in this league, it's not about intercepting a pass, every other week. It's about shutting the other team's receiver down consistently. And Sauce Gardner does that. And the other thing about Sauce Gardner is, just talked about getting a reputation. Usually it takes years for that to happen. In 2009, that was Darrelle Revis's best season. That's when he was first team All-Pro. It's when he kind of broke onto the scene. It's when teams started realizing how great he was, and the media started realizing how great he was. That season, he had more targets against him than any corner in the NFL. It wasn't until 2010, the next year, where teams stopped throwing at him. So the reason I bring this up is, like, halfway through Sauce's rookie year, he already had that reputation. Teams just stopped throwing at him because they knew they couldn't complete it against him. So I completely disagree with the idea Sauce Gardner's been disappointed. Sauce Gardner's, you'd like to see some interceptions. Sauce Gardner's job, though, is how we define Sauce Gardner is not whether he gets interceptions. It's how he prevents other teams from completing passes against him. And he's done that as well as any player in the NFL since he stepped into the field. I mean, I've said this myself. I'll say it again. I've never said this about a Jets player 2 years. I said it a year ago. I said it 1 year into his career. I've never said it about a Jets player this quickly. I'll probably never say it about a Jets player this quickly again. Unless there's like some injury or some unexpected thing, Sauce Gardner is going to be in the Hall of Fame one day. I mean, that's how good he's been the first 2 seasons. There's a strong case he's already the best corner in the NFL. There's a strong case he was already the best corner in the NFL as a rookie. He is an absolutely dominant player. And you can't use these counting statistics. I remember the Jets had this guy, Marcus Williams, who was an undrafted free agent signing out of North Dakota State. Back in 2014, the Jets, it was the Idzik year where they had no corners, so they were trying anything, and they threw Marcus Williams into the lineup. And to be fair, Marcus Williams actually had a stretch where he was actually a pretty decent depth corner. And for an undrafted free agent, that's pretty good. So I don't want to bash Marcus Williams. But I remember the first game they threw him into the lineup. It was against the Kansas City Chiefs. And he registered a lot of tackles. He may have led the Jets in tackles that day. If he wasn't, he was close. It was a lot of tackles. And people looked at the box score and said, wow, he had a lot of tackles. Look, it was like the Jets found a corner. I'm sitting there saying, no, that's not how you judge a corner. You don't want your corner to lead the team in tackles, because most of the time when a corner gets a tackle, it's because he's allowed a completion and then tackles the guy who caught the ball. So just another example of why you can't use these counting stats to judge corner play. There's much more that goes into it. There's much more nuance. Fortunately, with the advent of advanced statistics, fortunately, we're starting to learn more about these things. We have more resources at our disposal. We'll have better stats going forward. But I mean, I think by any metrics, Sauce Gardner has been a spectacular success. I'm thrilled to have Sauce Gardner on this team. He hasn't just justified the 4th overall pick. He's exceeded all expectations. He has been dominant. Everything you want in a corner, and I'll take him any day of the week. I mean, arguably the best corner in the league. No, you can't say anything bad about Sauce Gardner. Thank you again, Dolphins fan, for watching the show, listening to the show. But I'm sorry, you're wrong on that. Sauce Gardner's phenomenal. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday. We'll be back on our regular schedule, 5 days a week starting next week. Can't wait to talk to you then.